David Raynes, who is a well-known commentator on drug-related matters in the United Kingdom. He used to be the Assistant Chief Investigation Officer with the British Customs, and he has been extremely active discussing drug-related matters for many, many years. So good morning to you, David Raynes.
Good morning.
Well, we have understood that there is quite a lot of turmoil when it comes to the British drugs policy. We read more or less every day about different ideas how to handle drug-related matters in your country. What about drugs and the political parties and the various views within the parties on drugs? Could you elaborate a bit on that, please?
Yes, okay. We have three main political parties. The Conservatives and Labour are the two main parties, and one or either of those is always in government. Mm-hmm. And we have a third party, the Liberal Democrats. Now, it's true to say that all parties have fringe activists who are, what I would say, pro-drug, pro-liberalisation or pro-legalisation, particularly of cannabis, and would be in part of the political spectrum that I wouldn't agree with. But their numbers are very few in the Conservatives and few in Labour. There are rather more in the Liberal Democrats, and maybe what stimulated this discussion with me today is that the Liberal Democrats are going to discuss at their conference decriminalisation on the Portuguese model, and there's a body of opinion within their party asking for legalisation again, particularly of cannabis. So the Liberal Democrats cannot form a government and will not form a government, so we're never going to have a legalisation policy in the UK in the foreseeable future. But nevertheless, there are tensions there, and if one of the other main parties needs the Liberal Democrats to form a coalition, which we have at the moment, one can see that the Liberal Democrats would exert more force than they have before. So we have to be cautious about the situation.
But with the present government, as we have understood, they are not in favour at all of any form of decriminalisation or legalisation.
No, we have a Conservative-led coalition with the Liberal Democrats in there, but drugs, because there's such a difference between the Conservative position and the Liberal Democrat position, drugs was left out of the coalition agreement. There is a coalition agreement covering lots of aspects of government, but drugs was left out, and the Conservative position, which you and I would agree with, prevails. So nothing is going to change. Now, we have in the leader, in our Prime Minister, we have David Cameron, and as a young politician, he was a member of a parliamentary committee, and it's true to say that he had liberalisation tendencies. In fact, it's a committee I gave evidence to, and he asked me some rather probing questions. It's true to say that since he became leader, he's changed his position somewhat. And in 2008, he was asked a question on Sky Television News, which actually came from me. I had prompted the question, and he actually said that the committee he'd been part of had made a mistake in relation to cannabis policy. So he is really pinned down now, and I don't think he's going to alter his position. The vast majority of the British public are against legalisation or liberalisation, and when we have parliamentary candidates, oddball candidates, standing on a drugs legalisation platform, they tend to do very badly. In fact, you may be aware of the organisation Transform there in the UK. Their leader, Danny Kushlik, stood on the drugs legalisation platform in his home city of Bristol, near where I live, and lost his cash deposit that he had to put forward as a candidate. So those candidates don't do well, but there is a political body across all parties that pushes for liberalisation and decriminalisation. It isn't going to happen, is my view.
Well, if we look at the media, I remember back many years ago in the mid-90s, I think it was, when The Independent made a big fuss about the possibility of legalization of cannabis, but then they apologized for this a few years later.
Yes, what you're remembering is, I think it was The Independent on Sunday, and the then editor was a lady called Rosie Boycott, and she called for the legalization of cannabis. That was in about 1995. And in fact, Britain's drug problems Well, our policies worked best when all the political parties sung from the same song sheet, as we say in English, and they all were broadly in agreement. And from the mid-90s, we had media advocacy for legalization and decriminalization, more strident and getting more strident, and the Rosie boycott campaign in The Independent started it. But, she's retired from The Independent, and a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, The Independent said it had been wrong about cannabis. And that's partly because of the efforts of me and others who agree with me. We had a campaign against the downgrading of cannabis, and in fact it was reclassified upwards again. And there was some science to support us, Professor Robin Murray and others.
What about the description and the coverage of the drug-related problems in the media today?
Well, yes, drugs, it tends to make a sexy headline. And quite often we tend to get it when there's not much happening politically, and the newspapers are looking for something to write, and frequently we will have commentators coming out with a legalization cry, and then it gets discussed on television or on the radio, and then we have radio phone-in programs in which people like me frequently take part. I had, and then it goes away, and then it comes again. I think because obviously the English language controls the internet for most nations, even if it's not their first tongue. Anything that happens in the UK tends to get passed around the world very quickly, and so you learn about these discussions, and they do happen. But it's partly to do with the English language, and it's partly to do with the internet.
So, what do you think then will happen in Britain regarding drug-related problems in the next couple of years?
Well, the big argument at the moment is about treatment of addicts, and the Conservatives came into power a year ago, and they let's go back before then. Under the last Labour government, since 1997, we'd had an increasing policy of maintenance on methadone for opiate and heroin addicts, and it came about 3 years ago. It transpired that only 3% or so of people were becoming free of addiction after being treated by methadone. And self-evidently, that wasn't resolving their addiction. And there's been a big push for more treatment and rehabilitation. Indeed, some evidence that addicts get treated by methadone become longer-term addicts, and it's even harder to get them off. And in addition, we've had a lot of deaths associated with what is effectively government-prescribed methadone. I happen to have the statistics for Scotland. I think it was 170 deaths methadone-associated last year, which is an incredible number out of 300 and so drug-associated deaths. So methadone is not a terribly good idea for a very long time, and yet in Britain we had that. So the Conservatives have been trying to get a policy of more rehabilitation. Unfortunately, some of the public servants who are still working on the programme are the same public servants who fell in love with methadone prescription. And you will know that there are heavy forces within the pharmaceutical industry who love methadone prescription. One of the people I associate with, Professor McKegney at Glasgow University, wrote in the Scotsman newspaper about methadone prescription, challenging the idea of it, and within 24 hours we had a letter from Alex Wodak in Australia, who's a legalization campaigner, arguing against McKegney. Now, what was Wodak doing interfering in what one might think was a British and indeed Scottish debate? So international pressure for us to maintain high methadone maintenance is there. I also spoke about that committee that Cameron was on, to which I gave evidence. I mean, I had an argument with the chairman of that committee about heroin maintenance, because that committee asked and argued for more heroin maintenance. Well, there isn't really a country in the world that's got more experience of heroin maintenance than the UK, because we've always had some of it since the 1920s. And we sort of drifted away from it at the end of the 60s because we realized it wasn't destroying the criminal market. So these tensions are there, these debates go on. The big problem is rehab, and that's the one that's being discussed at the moment. We will have this little discussion about Portugal. I think Portugal's misrepresented, but I don't think the Liberal Democrats will be able to, even if they carry it at their conference, I don't think they'll be able to influence the Conservative-led government.
Well, finally, there was quite a lot of discussion coming from the government's advisory committee or advisory council.
Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs.
Yeah, but it has been very quiet now recently.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of the fuss was around cannabis. When the cannabis got declassified, we have a three-tier system, A, B, and C for our drugs. Cannabis was traditionally B from the mid-60s. And the classification is supposed to represent the harm, but it also represents a signal to the law enforcement, which I used to do, as to how much effort we should put in and how seriously the courts take offences. Cannabis was in Class B, the penalties were set, and we had Home Secretary David Blunkett, who said he was minded to downgrade cannabis. He did downgrade cannabis to C. The penalties became less. He had a problem with the penalties because if he'd had his way entirely, tobacco smuggling would have been more important than cannabis smuggling, and so he had to adjust the penalties back. But after 4 years, the Labour government was persuaded that it had made a mistake. Psychosis was rising, and the pressure for change to reclassify cannabis upwards came from the Department of Health, who were picking up the damage in the mental hospitals. And the Professor Appleby was the National Director of Mental Health, was very instrumental in reclassifying, and it was reclassified despite the Advisory Council saying it shouldn't be. And then you will remember there was the fuss about Professor Nutt. I can go into that if you wish.
So what?
Well, Professor Nutt was the technical director of the Advisory Council when the cannabis was reclassified upwards, and he'd argued against that. And then he became the chairman of the Advisory Council, and he had been making inconsistent statements for quite a while. In New Zealand, he'd made a radio broadcast playing with the idea of legalization, and he made some statements which really were incompatible with his official position. And I and others campaigned for him to be removed, and indeed, government did remove him. And of course, he's been very noisy since. The chairman now of the Advisory Council is a friend of Nutt, Professor Iverson, but he has been much more sort of understanding of the government position. The government has to be cautious, and it was cautious about cannabis when it reclassified. And there's much less controversy around the Advisory Council than there used to be.
So to sum things up then, very, very briefly, one could say obviously that decriminalization or legalization of cannabis and or any other drug is not going to happen in the foreseeable future. Is that correct?
The Conservatives have said that they're not going to decriminalize. They've said that emphatically less than 2 months ago. I don't believe that will happen in this Parliament, and we've got another 3 to 4 years of this Parliament. What happens at the end of that, we'll have a new Parliament. If it's a coalition between Conservatives and Lib Dems, or Lib Dems and Labour, we may have the Lib Dems trying to exert some pressure. But even they are split. The pressure for decriminalisation and legalisation in the Lib Dems comes from the youth element, and they have a curious situation in their party where they allow their conference and they allow that to make policy, which, that means the strident activist groups can push policy in a certain direction, which isn't so easy in other parties. But I don't think it'll happen. Basically, I'm suggesting to it won't happen. But we do still have a major problem in the UK. We've got a problem with our young people with alcohol, major problem with alcohol, and we have a problem in young people apparently prepared to put almost any substance into their bodies, which is a big cultural issue, and that cultural issue around drugs is the long-term educational and prevention problem. If we could stop young people experimenting with drugs, or delay experimentation even a few years, we would have achieved an awful lot.
Well, thank you, David Raynes. You've just listened to him. Mr. Raynes is a well-known commentator on drug-related matters and a former Assistant Chief Investigation Officer with the British Customs. Thank you very much for talking to us.